Schooner La Petite, Captain O.B. Smith, overtaken by a gale on Lake Huron, 1871. Steamer Ironsides, sank in a gale near Grand Haven, 1873, 28 lives lost. Schooner Gilbert Mollison, lost with all hands near South Manitou Island, 1873. Schooner Kate L. Bruce, lost on Lake Huron, 1877, never heard of again. Schooner E. M. Peck, foundered during a storm on Lake Michigan, 1868, 8 lives lost. Schooner South America, under Captain Brady, left Buffalo for Toledo, 1843, never seen again.
With dreams of blue water splashed by the bow, a young man grows weary of the horse and plow. Forsaking a warm bed, fresh fruit and meat, he signs up to adventure the ways of the sea. Now a schooner is lovely, sleek, fast and trim, e'en loaded with cargo, she flies with the wind. But with a fine crew and captain, she'll still always be forever at the mercy of the ways of the sea. Now if you're intending to hoist up the sail, remember there's a many who've tried it and failed. But if breathing that sea wind is your cup of tea, good luck and good fortune with the ways of the sea.
More than a century ago, the Chippewa chief Kitchawiski paddled a canoe from Duluth to Buffalo and then walked on to Washington to attend a congressional conference on Indian affairs. When the conference was over, he walked back to Buffalo, pushed his canoe out of a screen of willows, and paddled the 988 miles back to Duluth. He found the lakes a convenient route to travel. The Great Lakes rapidly became the main commercial waterways of the entire upper Midwest. Up and down the lakes, steamers and windjammers carried people and freight for the growing country. The late 19th century was the golden era of sailing ships on the Great Lakes. From the close of the Civil War through the 1880s, industry boomed along the lakes. Tall ships spread their sails across the water, carrying grain, lumber, ore, and thousands of immigrants seeking the promised land to the west. Locomotives, dynamite, and coal for the mines of Upper Michigan and Minnesota were sent up the lakes. Lumber from Wisconsin, Upper Michigan, and the Canadian shores of Lake Huron came down to Cleveland and Chicago. Grain was sent east from Chicago and Milwaukee to Buffalo. Ore mined in Michigan's Upper Peninsula went to the smelters of Detroit and Cleveland. The completion of the Sioux Canal in 1855 opened Lake Superior to the rest of the lakes. Eventually, sailing ships carried Ohio wheat to England. Although steamers appeared on the lakes in the 1820s, the schooners carried bulk freight more economically and with favorable winds, faster. Early steamers were built with masts and sails and only used steam when winds were unfavorable. Eventually, steamers would prove more dependable and maintain better average speeds. In 1832, 20,000 people sailed into Chicago. 2,000 stayed. The rest spread out across the Illinois country. All kinds of sailing vessels were built and launched by the hundreds along the Great Lakes. At first, they were square riggers, like the ocean-going vessels. Soon, the schooners with fore and aft sails like modern sailboats replaced the square riggers. These schooners required smaller crews and were easier to load and unload. The shallow harbors and canals of the trade routes meant the Great Lakes vessels had to be built with shallow drafts. A design specially suited for the Great Lakes was needed. Around the 1850s, in a Manitowoc, Wisconsin boatyard, William Bates developed the trim clipper-type schooner for the lakes. The Lakers, as they came to be called, were of shallow draft but had a centerboard in the keel. This allowed them to beat to windward, something the square riggers were unable to do. These Lakers were extremely fast, capable of doing 13 knots in a good wind. As commerce and lumbering expanded, so did the number of ships plying the Great Lakes. In 1848, there were 140 steamers and almost 800 commercial sailing ships on the lakes. 8 years later, 1,150 sail and 240 steamships traveled the trade routes. At their peak in the 1880s, over 2,000 sailing vessels traversed the Great Lakes. Ships were generally built by or for individual owners who were often the captains. Crew at first were recruited from saltwater ships. Then more and more local men along the lakes signed on. Captains sailing these freshwater seas had to be first-rate sailors and pilots. The lakes are large, the shores irregular and rocky with many islands and shoals. Harbors were few and far between, often too far in a storm. Waves on the Great Lakes have a steep chop, hard on both boat and crew. Even experienced ocean sailors would find themselves seasick. Great Lakes weather constantly changes. Furious storms arrive in minutes. According to old hands, the only difference between Great Lakes storms and ocean storms is the taste of salt in the spray.
Well, this is a nice day on the lakes, but as everybody knows, there are some very bad days, particularly the month that we worry about on the Great Lakes is the month of November. And that is the month in which many great ships have been lost. In the early days, there were so many shipwrecks that they couldn't really be counted. And of course, the number one culprit, we'll say, on the Great Lakes was Lake Michigan. And the sailors had a term at the time that a ship would disappear, and they would simply say, well, she went through a crack in the lakes. Michigan has no harbor, really, for the ships to go into. If they're in a storm, they have to fight out the storm. That's it. There's no help.
Lake vessels are always in danger of being driven on the rocky shoals. Many schooners spent their last hours unsuccessfully clawing off a lee shore. Navigation was a matter of dead reckoning, checked where possible by landmarks. Few charts, buoys, or other aids to navigation existed. With hundreds of ships sailing up and down the lakes in fog, snow, and darkness, many collided and sank. In September 1860, the schooner Augusta rammed the Lady Elgin, an excursion steamer bound from Milwaukee to Chicago. 287 lives were lost when the Lady Elgin sank. Countless ships foundered, capsized, and ran aground, or simply sailed through a crack in the lake with all aboard, part of the vanished fleet of the Great Lakes. Few persons survived shipwreck. The Great Lakes are always cold, even on the hottest August day. The shipping season lasted into November until ice jammed the rivers and canals. Autumn storms brought layers of ice on the deck and frozen spray in the rigging. Survivors clinging to the masts of a stranded schooner often froze to death before they could be rescued. In the 20 years between 1878 and 1898, 6,000 ships were wrecked on the Great Lakes, almost one a day. Of these, over 1,000 were total losses. Lake Michigan itself claims more major shipping disasters than all the other Great Lakes combined. The prevailing west-northwesterly winds sweep its long length, rolling up mountainous seas. Its shores afforded few natural or man-made harbors. Tricky currents flow through the Straits of Mackinac. Once clear of the straits, ships held course almost due west. Then a crucial decision faced the captain. Chicago lay some 300 miles to the south. Should he take the longer, more westerly route down the lake and stay clear of the Beaver and Manitou Islands? Or should he risk the shoals and rocky shores of Gray's Reef and Manitou Passage, thereby saving 50 miles. Many took the second choice. One was the schooner Ida. On a cold September morning near the turn of the century, the Ida was heading through the Manitou Passage with a cargo of corn. Hardly 12 miles out, the skies darkened and a storm blew up. Heavy seas battered the helpless schooner. Captain and crew managed to launch the longboat and abandon ship. Drifting helplessly, the Ida capsized and finally sank. One by one, the tall ships disappeared from the Great Lakes. Storms, fires, and rocky shoals claimed many. The relics of an era gone by remained deep beneath the waves. The surviving ships were all eventually driven off the Great Lakes by the larger freight carriers. The age of sail came to an end on the Great Lakes.
Intending to hoist up the sail, remember there's a many who've tried it and failed. But if breathing that sea wind is your cup of tea, good luck and good fortune with the ways of the sea.